When we think about crime and punishment in the Middle Ages, we often picture a confusing system of justice and harsh sentences that don't seem to fit the crime. Law and order were strict in Europe in the Middle Ages. People thought that they would only act well if they were afraid of what would happen to them if they broke the law. Most English towns had a gibbet on the edge of town. Criminals would be hanged there, and their bodies would be left to rot for many weeks as a stark reminder of what would happen if they broke the law. But it was clear that this wasn't the big deterrent that the government had thought it would be. In just 1 year, 114 people were killed, 89 were robbed with violence, and 65 were hurt in the northern city of Lincoln. In 1202, there were only 7,000 people living in Lincoln, so those numbers seem very high. And when you think about how only 2 people were put to death for these crimes, it seems like a lot of people in the Middle Ages were getting away with crimes. Let's go back to the Middle Ages and see what it was like to be a bad guy back then. Blasphemy. In Middle Ages Europe, the Catholic Church was the most powerful group, and many countries kept order by making people follow religion or canon laws as well as laws made by the monarch. Blasphemy meant not acknowledging God or coming up with thoughts that were not approved by the Church. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar and philosopher, thought that blasphemy was a sin worse than murder because it was aimed at God instead of another person. The leaders of Islam in the Middle Ages also thought this was true. In Kuwait, punishments were as harsh as they could get. People were usually stoned, burned at the stake, or had their heads crushed by an elephant. In ancient Europe, there were many horrible ways to punish the crime, such as garroting in Spain, cutting off body parts in Germany, and flogging or branding in England. Blasphemy was a sin that was easy to do, which was bad. Just one small mistake in the wrong place with the wrong person could turn someone into a criminal overnight. Murder. Many people have tried to figure out why the Middle Ages in Europe were so deadly. Historians have said that almost everyone had seen a murder happen or knew someone who had. People say that in the Middle Ages, you were more likely to be killed than to die by mistake in Oxford or London. After a murder, it was easy to get away from the scene of the crime. In medieval Europe, there were large stretches of woods and farmland between cities. This made it easy for a criminal to get away, and it was unlikely that they would be found. Almost no one enforced the law, but some Italian city-states were lucky enough to have paid police agents. Theft. People in the Middle Ages took for many of the same reasons that people do today. During the Middle Ages, theft was likely one of the most popular crimes. Like killers, thieves in the Middle Ages could easily get away without being caught. How crimes were seen and how harshly they were punished seemed to depend on where the crime took place. In 1353, a woman in the French town of Mihavel washed her clothes in a nearby stream and hung them up to dry on a frame. When she got back, someone had taken her coat. A 15-year-old boy was caught and charged with the crime. A court found him guilty of stealing a few days later, and he was kicked out of the town for 3 months. In the year 1417 in London, a man named Edmund H. Chappell from the neighborhood of Finsbury was accused of stealing a horse, 4 bolts of cloth, and other things. A jury found him guilty and told him he would be hanged. Even though the crimes are pretty much the same, the sentences are very different. It seems like different places had very different ideas about what kind of punishments were fair. Corruption. In 1249, some traders from the Belgian province of Brabant told King Henry III that they had been robbed in the county of Hampshire, where they were doing business. The port of Southampton and the Palace of Winchester were both in Hampshire, which was a busy, thriving place. The suspects were found, put on trial, and then found not guilty. But the traders kept saying they were unhappy. King Henry listened to his counselors and was not happy to learn that travelers were often attacked in Hampshire and that there was a plot to hide the crime from the justices, which included juries who helped the robbers. Corruption seems to have been a big problem, and many gangs had ties to rich and important people like knights and nobility. Even the most important people were lying. In 1350, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, Sir William Thorpe, was put in jail for taking money. Maybe this is why the warrants were never found guilty and why jury after jury found them not guilty, even though they had been bad in the past and had a bad name. It's possible that they were part of a plot and gave some of the money they stole to the people who would decide their fate. Finding sanctuary. Obviously, if you were a guilty criminal and could get to a church, you could always claim sanctuary. Most people who were on the run in medieval Europe did so because they had stolen something or killed someone. Once the criminal was inside a temple or church, they were safe because it was against the law for their pursuers to go inside. The criminal could even bring a bow and arrow or another weapon into the church and use it to attack the people chasing them from the windows. Once everyone was safe inside, the hope was that a deal could be made with the person who had been hurt, and the offender would be allowed to leave safely. In most European churches, a person could only stay in refuge for 40 days, but for the English, there was no limit. In England, in the 1200s, anyone who asked for refuge had to leave their country for good and could only come back if the king gave them a pardon. Going to jail was worse than going to sanctuary and then exile. The food in jail was bad and hard to get, and it was easy to get sick. Not many people made it. Anyone who broke the rules of refuge had to pay a lot of money. Self-killing. Poor Lawrence's body was treated so badly because people thought that killing yourself was also a crime. As early as the 6th century, the Catholic Church saw suicide as a form of murder and didn't let the person's family give them a proper funeral. By the 12th century, this so-called self-murder was seen as a crime under both civil law and church law in Europe because it robbed a feudal lord of one of his possessions. Instead of going to the suicide's family, the suicide's land and belongings would go to the king's treasury. At the beginning of the 15th century in France, the law said that a suicide victim's house, fields, and woods had to be destroyed. As if that wasn't bad enough, the bodies of suicide victims who were just seen as normal criminals were often tortured. Some of them would be hung or dragged through the streets by a horse, and others would be burned to show how horrible it is to kill yourself. In England, a man who killed himself was buried at an intersection with a stake through his heart to hold his body in place. Strangely, people thought that this would keep the ghost from coming back and making more trouble. If the stakes didn't hold the soul, it would hopefully get lost at the crossroads and take the wrong road, which would send it to another village or town to cause trouble. It's hard to figure out how much wrongdoing really happened during the Middle Ages. But since many social wrongdoings like gambling, scolding, vagrancy, sexual crimes, and even eavesdropping were also made illegal, it seems like both the church and the state were trying to get control over even the smallest wrongdoings. We hope you liked this video. Subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about civilization or time period we should talk about. Also watch another video here.